grandson of H.G. Wells, the great-grandson of H.G. Wells.
Right. We didn't bring the children, but we could have had great-great-grandchildren.
I never knew him terribly well because I was 11 when the war broke out in Europe, and the old man rather bloody-mindedly insisted on living in London, and you didn't take grandchildren to visit grandfather because the place was being fairly consistently bombed. But the old man lived until I was about 15, 16. I met him a few times when I was small. He used to give marvellous birthday parties on his birthday because he could never remember the dates of the birthdays of his grandchildren. So grandfather's birthday was when you got the bicycle, the train set, all the things that you really hoped for. But I think in a way the most interesting thing was how he pulled himself up by his bootstraps. He was more or less self-educated to start with. They tried to get him to do respectable things. They tried to apprentice him to a draper's and later to a pharmacist, and he flunked out on both of those. He then got a curious job as a sort of pupil teacher, and eventually he got a scholarship to go to London University, which was really the sort of making of him because he came out with first-class degree in zoology. And if you think about it, most of his early novels, the ones that he really made his name about, Time Machine, Dr. Moreau, Invisible Man, they were all biological novels. So his big distinguishing feature was he was probably the first writer to cash in on a science education.
Well, if you took their DNA, it would match H.G. Wells' DNA. The DNA would be a perfect match.
The man, H.G. Wells, had such a fabulously complicated life, you couldn't sum it up in a quick statement. He had extraordinary sort of social views that he expressed in a lot of his later books, but it also, in his early work, had been this sort of visionary creator of a whole new literary form. Science fiction really didn't exist apart from a few writers at the time, and was not known as science fiction per se, and he pretty much brought that to the world.
Well, one doesn't realise now, because this sort of alien invasion stuff is commonplace. But it wasn't in 98. It was an entirely novel idea.
And so, end of the 19th century, there was an enormous sort of burst of literacy in England, and a lot of magazines serialized stories. So H.G. actually published all of his novels as serials in a magazine first, and in the case of War of the Worlds, it came out in Pearson magazine, and was then turned into a book later. And when Wells wrote War of the Worlds, he was actually very much on an up and up. He'd written like 3 hugely successful novels prior to this. It's quite interesting that before Time Machine, he'd been nowhere. He'd been writing as a desperate attempt to do something to make a living because he'd had to give up being a school teacher due to an injury that he had got. So writing was very much a fallback career for him, which had suddenly and very unexpectedly just blossomed. And so, yeah, War of the Worlds finds him a young man still, but he's a name that people look for. They're looking forward to his next publication.
I think it's interesting that a scientist allowed himself to have an imagination because, most scientists just work from absolutes and they don't allow themselves to go, beyond the known universe. But I think what helped him was, I think he was a philosopher. I think he was a philosopher/scientist. And there was a political climate that created enough anger in H.G. Wells that he was able to write this story in response to some of his frustration with British colonialism and other hot point issues of the day.
The thing that's extraordinary is not only was this a successful book, but then many, many years after it's first serialized and then published, it gets turned into a completely other medium with Orson Welles in 1938 doing his legendary broadcast, where his theatre company had a regular broadcast, but they broke in to bring news reports of this alien landing that was going on. And quite literally, many people who tuned in to listen missed the introduction that explained that it was a dramatization, were quite panicked by this. Apparently H.G. was actually quite bothered by the irresponsible way in which Orson Welles had just kind of fomented panic in people across the States.
But later in life, he actually met and rather liked Orson Welles. They got on rather well together.
George Pal was a movie producer in Hollywood in the 50s and 60s who had a real love for H.G. Wells' writing. And in 53, he produced the movie version of War of the Worlds, and then went on also in 1960 to do The Time Machine.
They're trying to go across the Hudson, and these things have started to come at them. And they're tripods, just like the original book. We went with what Wells originally intended, which is to have the machines not be flying saucers, but be tripods.
I like the tripods in the pictures we saw.
Oh, good.
This has gone back to something much more authentic than the George Pal.
The George Pal version.
The George Pal ones
exactly.
I think H.G. would be enormously gratified to know that his novels are still current and that he's still actually published. But I think he would be astonished to realize that 100 years after he's written them, they're still being remade into new movies. It does speak to the kind of timelessness of the thematic material that's embodied in the stories.